He finally spoke, and what he said made everything more complicated. What did he say? The subway vigilante. The man at the center of the case was finally identified, and after days of silence, he spoke. What he said was expected to bring clarity, to explain what happened on that subway train. But instead, it raised a different question. Not just what he did, but why he did it. By the time Bernhard Goetz finally came into public view, he was no longer just a man connected to a subway shooting. He had already become an idea, a symbol, a name people attached their own beliefs to. But behind all of that, there was still a real person. And the more people learned about him, the more complicated the story became. Bernhard Goetz was not a police officer. He was not a trained security professional. He was a private citizen, an electronics technician, someone who had been moving through the same city as everyone else. On the surface, there was nothing dramatic about that. Nothing that suggested his name would one day be known across the country. But there was one part of his past that quickly became impossible to ignore. A few years earlier, he had been attacked. In 1981, Goetz was assaulted by a group of young men. Reports described it as a violent encounter, one that left an impression far beyond the physical moment itself. Whatever happened that night did not stay in the past. It followed him, and that mattered, because fear rarely begins in the moment people see. It usually begins earlier, in memory, in experience. In the quiet ways, someone starts preparing for something they believe could happen again. That previous attack helped explain why Bernhard Goetz was carrying a gun in the first place. It helped explain why he may have interpreted a confrontation on a subway train differently than someone else would have. For some people, this changed everything. It made his reaction seem more human, more understandable. Not because the shooting was easy to defend, but because fear, once learned deeply enough, can change the way a person sees danger. A sentence, a movement, a group approaching too closely. None of those things exist in isolation once fear has already taken root. But there was another side to that same story, because understanding someone's fear does not automatically justify what they do with it. And that became the deeper tension in the case. Was Bernhard Goetz a man acting from trauma, or a man who had allowed old fear to become something harder, sharper, and more dangerous? The more people asked that question, the less simple he became. Supporters saw a citizen shaped by the reality of New York in that era. A man who had already learned the hard way that vulnerability could be punished. To them, the shooting was not born from aggression. It was born from a city that had trained people to expect harm before it arrived. Critics saw something else. They saw a man who had armed himself illegally and brought that mindset onto a crowded train. A man whose personal fear had become public violence. A man who was now being defended not because the facts were clear, but because so many people were carrying the same anger and anxiety inside themselves. And that is what made Bernhard Goetz so difficult to place. He did not fit neatly into one role. He was not easily reduced to monster or hero. He stood in a far more uncomfortable space, a space where fear, memory, law, and judgment were all colliding at once. And the more the public tried to define him, the more one truth became clear. This case could not be understood only by looking at what happened on the train. It also had to be understood by looking at what Bernhard Goetz believed about the world before he ever stepped onto it. For days after the shooting, Bernhard Goetz was gone. That absence had already started shaping the story. The longer he remained missing, the more people projected their own conclusions onto his silence. Some saw the disappearance as proof of guilt. Others saw it as proof of fear. But eventually, the man at the center of the case would have to reappear. And when he did, the story changed again. Goetz resurfaced in New Hampshire, far from the subway car, far from the city that had turned him into a national headline. By then, his face and his name were known. The mystery of who he was had been replaced by a new question. What would he say? He turned himself in to the police. That moment carried its own symbolism. He had not been dragged into public view by force. He had stepped back into it. But surrender did not erase the days he had spent missing. It only sharpened the questions already surrounding him. Why leave it all? Why stay away so long? Why not remain at the scene if he truly believed he had acted lawfully? Those questions stayed with him as he entered custody. And then came the next crucial stage, his explanation. Because up to that point, almost everything had been built on witness accounts, newspaper framing, and public fear. Now, the man himself would begin to define the story. When someone finally speaks after days of silence, people expect clarity. But clarity is not always what they get. Sometimes they get something more revealing, something less polished, something that says more than intended. And that would soon happen here. Before the courtroom, before the verdicts, before the years of debate that followed, there was first the moment in which Bernhard Goetz had to describe what had been happening inside his own mind. What he thought he saw, what he thought was about to happen, and why he fired. That explanation was supposed to answer the central question of the case. Instead, it would deepen it. Because surrender does not end uncertainty. Sometimes it only gives uncertainty a voice. And once Bernhard Goetz began speaking, the case moved into a new phase. No longer just a public reaction to violence, no longer just a city arguing with itself. Now, it was also about intention, about perception, about whether fear can explain force, and whether explanation is the same thing as justification. The man who had vanished was back. But instead of closing the gap in the story, his return opened a much deeper one. When Bernhard Goetz gave his account, one part of it stood out immediately. Not because it was legally complicated, but because it sounded emotionally unmistakable. Until that point, many people who defended him had built their case around a simple idea: self-defense. A man cornered on a subway train, a city filled with danger, a split-second decision made under pressure. It was an argument many people were ready to accept. But then came the statements about Daryl Caby. Caby had already been shot. He was down. And according to accounts of Goetz's own words, there was a moment after the initial chaos when he looked at him and fired again. Reports would later focus on a chilling detail, that Goetz indicated he had seen Caby still moving, still present, and chose to shoot once more. That detail changed the emotional temperature of the case, because the final shot no longer sounded like panic. It sounded deliberate, and if it was deliberate, the entire meaning of the shooting shifted. This was the point where the public narrative began to split again, but in a different way than before. The first divide had been broad: hero or criminal, citizen or vigilante. But this new divide was more uncomfortable. It asked whether someone could begin in fear and end in something else. Could a person act in self-defense at first and then cross a line? That possibility made the case far more difficult to defend. Supporters tried to argue that perception under stress is not clean, that seconds can feel distorted, that once someone believes they are fighting for survival, the mind does not always stop the moment an outside observer thinks it should. But critics heard something else in the statement. They heard anger, retaliation, a decision made after the threat had already been neutralized. And once that possibility entered the case, it never fully left. Because laws can evaluate actions, but the public often reacts first to tone, to feeling, to what a statement suggests about the mind behind the act. And the tone of this statement was hard to ignore. It seemed to reveal something deeper than fear, not just a man who felt threatened, but a man who had already imagined this kind of confrontation before it ever happened. A man whose response may have carried more than the facts of that one moment, more than the request for $5, more perhaps than the law was fully prepared to measure. This was the point where many people who had rushed to defend Bernhard Goetz began to hesitate. Not all of them, but enough. Because now the case was no longer centered only on danger, it was centered on intention. And intention is where public sympathy often begins a collapse. The city still argued, the newspapers still debated. But from this point on, no one could talk about the shooting without also talking about that final shot, that statement, and the possibility that whatever happened on the train had gone beyond fear. That one explanation did not settle the case, it transformed it. If the threat was over, why was there one more shot? Once the case entered the courtroom, the country was no longer just watching a shooting. It was watching a test of how the legal system would interpret fear, a test of how far self-defense could reach, and a test of whether public emotion would match legal judgment. Bernhard Goetz faced serious charges, including attempted murder, assault, reckless endangerment, and illegal possession of a firearm. On paper, the case looked heavy. 4 young men had been shot. One of them, Darrell Cabey, had been permanently paralyzed. The public intensity surrounding the story only made the proceedings more significant. But courtroom trials do not run on atmosphere alone. They run on standards, on burdens of proof, on what can be shown and what cannot. The prosecution's argument centered on excess, on the idea that whatever fear Goetz may have felt, the force he used went beyond what could reasonably be justified. The final shot mattered here more than ever. So did the absence of weapons on the 4 young men. The prosecution needed the jury to see not only danger, but overreaction. The defense took a different path. They focused on perception, not what a perfect observer might have concluded from outside the moment, but what Bernhard Goetz himself believed inside it. They argued that New York's climate of fear was not theoretical. It was real, that his past experience with violence mattered, that on a subway train, confronted by 4 young men, he believed he was about to be robbed or worse. In other words, the defense did not need to prove that danger had objectively existed in the clearest possible way. They needed to persuade the jury that Bernhard Goetz believed it did. That distinction mattered, because self-defense, in practice, often lives in the gap between what happened and what someone thought was about to happen. And that gap is rarely easy to measure. The trial forced the courtroom to confront an uncomfortable reality. Cities produce not only crime, but expectations of crime. Fear becomes part of how people interpret ordinary and extraordinary moments alike. The jury was not being asked to evaluate the city, but the city was present in the case anyway, in every assumption about threat, hesitation, and response. When the verdicts came, they reflected that complexity. Goetz was acquitted of the most serious charges, including attempted murder and assault-related counts, but he was convicted on the firearm possession charge. Legally, that outcome sent a mixed message. It did not fully condemn him as a would-be murderer, but it did not fully vindicate him either. Instead, it carved out a narrow space between those two identities, a space the public had never been comfortable with. For supporters, the verdict confirmed what they had believed from the beginning, that the shooting was not treated as criminal violence in the fullest sense. For critics, the outcome felt like another example of how public fear can distort justice. And once again, the same verdict produced two different truths. Because court decisions end cases on paper, they do not always end them in the public mind. The criminal trial was not the end. Legal guilt and legal liability are not always the same thing, and this case would prove that in a very visible way. Darrell Cabey later brought a civil suit against Bernhard Goetz. By then, the public already understood the broad outline of the shooting. But the civil case asked a different kind of question. Not whether the state could prove criminal charges beyond a reasonable doubt, but whether harm had been done in a way that created responsibility. That is a lower threshold, a different legal world. And in that world, the results changed. Cabey had been left with catastrophic injuries. His life had been permanently altered. Whatever one believed about the opening seconds of the shooting, the long-term damage was undeniable. In civil court, that fact carried enormous weight. Goetz was found liable, and Cabey was awarded millions of dollars in damages. That result was important not only legally, but symbolically, because it revealed something the criminal case had not resolved. A person may avoid the most serious criminal consequences and still remain responsible for the destruction that followed. For some observers, this was the system correcting itself. For others, it was proof that the legal process still could not speak with one voice about what the shooting meant. But either way, the split between the criminal verdict and the civil judgment added another layer to the case. Not innocent, not fully justified, not entirely condemned in one court, but held responsible in another. The case resisted simplicity even at the end of its legal path. And perhaps that was fitting, because nothing about the story had ever stayed clean for long. Long after the courtroom battles ended, the case remained alive in public memory. Not because it was unresolved in a technical sense, but because it had touched something deeper than one event. It had exposed a city's fear, its anger, its exhaustion, and its willingness to turn one man into a symbol of all three. Bernhard Goetz remained a controversial figure for years. Some continued to see him as the man who stood up in a city where many felt abandoned. Others continued to see him as a warning about what happens when fear is allowed to redefine justice. That divide never fully disappeared, because the case belonged to a larger American conversation, one that has never really ended. What happens when public fear outruns public trust? What happens when people begin to believe that protection is no longer coming? And what happens when one person decides to act on that belief before the law ever arrives? These were bigger questions than the courtroom could answer. And that is why the case lasted. Not in records alone, but in memory, in arguments, in the stories people kept telling about what it meant. The shooting on that subway train lasted only seconds, but the case that followed lasted far longer, because it was never just about gunfire. It was about interpretation, about fear, about the way cities shape the people inside them. Some people looked at Bernhard Goetz and saw self-defense. Others looked at him and saw something close to permission. Permission for fear to become force. Permission for suspicion to become judgment. Permission for one person's sense of danger to become another person's irreversible punishment. And maybe that is why the case still matters, because it asks a question with no easy answer, not simply what happened, but what do people become willing to accept when they are afraid? The line between justice and opinion is easy to talk about when fear is distant. It becomes much harder to see when fear feels personal, when it feels immediate, when it feels familiar. And in New York, in 1984, that line had already begun to blur long before Bernhard Goetz ever stepped onto that train. By the end, the case did not leave behind a clean moral conclusion. It left behind something more unsettling. The possibility that facts alone are not always what divide people. Sometimes what divides them is what they believe those facts should mean. And in this story, that divide was the real aftermath. Because sometimes a case is remembered not for the certainty it created, but for the uncertainty it revealed. The court reached a decision. The system gave its answer. But the case didn't end there. Because some questions don't disappear with a verdict. They stay. In memory. In debate. In the way people continue to see what happened. And even now, there is no single version of this story that everyone agrees on. Next on True Echoes. The case in New York didn't end with one man, because just a few years later, the city would face another crime, one that shocked the public. A young woman attacked in Central Park, brutally. The story spread fast, and so did the pressure to find who was responsible. Within days, 5 teenagers were arrested. They confessed. The case seemed closed. But the truth wasn't that simple, because this time, the question wasn't only who committed the crime, it was how the system responded to it. And what happens when the need for answers becomes stronger than the need for truth. Next on Catching Killers, the Central Park 5. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. Because sometimes, a case is not remembered for what it proves, but for what it leaves unresolved. And in this story, the most lasting question was never what happened. It was what people chose to believe about it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Every voice matters. Subscribe and step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.